Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning, Brisbane. I hope you can hear me well. I'm joining you today from the lands of the Gadigal and Wongal peoples, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And I, like many of you, I'm sure, stand with our First Nations sisters and brothers in their demands for truth, justice, and reconciliation through our support for the Uluru Statement from the Heart. It's an absolute honour and privilege to be asked to deliver the annual Doug Everingham oration today, and my sincere thanks at the outset to the Honourable Claire Moore, to Dr. Danelle Davis, and to Rod Welford and all at UNAA Queensland for the invitation. Thanks too to Griffith University for hosting, and a huge congratulations to all the worthy recipients of the SDG Champions Awards. The work that you have done every day and continue to do in support of Australia's commitment to the SDGs is truly inspiring. The Honourable Dr. Douglas Nixon Everingham was a pioneer, an intellect, a man of compassion, a passionate defender of human rights, social justice and our democracy, and a true international citizen. At this point in my life, I feel like I'm wearing a few hats of relevance to this great man's legacy and to UNAA Queensland's work. So as some of you will know, and as Danelle mentioned, I spent over 10 years working with the UN in peacekeeping in places like Afghanistan, Kosovo, South Sudan, Timor-Leste, and Liberia, amongst some others, and most recently at UN headquarters as the Chief of Policy and Best Practice for UN peacekeeping. I still count myself as part of that diverse and courageous UN family. On coming home to Australia in 2016, this connection inevitably led me through another former Everingham orator, Major General retired Mike Smith, to the UNAA, with which I've been associated in various roles since then, and now very proudly as an ambassador for UNAA Queensland. The second hat I wear is one I'm about to hang up, which is as director of the Whitlam Institute within Western Sydney University. But there is obviously a very important connection to Doug here as well. And the third hat that I'm about to don is in my new role as Chief Executive of the Australian Human Rights Commission. Australia's National Human Rights Institution is a precious statutory institution that protects and promotes the rights of all Australians, but particularly marginalised Australians. And it also acts as an important bridge to the UN through its relationship with the UN Human Rights Council and the treaty reporting bodies and special procedures mechanisms. So sitting here in Sydney this morning, I'm wishing two things today. Firstly, that I could actually be in Brisbane with you all so that we could have a cup of tea and a chat about some of the issues you've been working on and talking about, and that I have been as well. And my second wish would be that I could have had a chance at several different points throughout my own career, as well as today, to talk with the Honourable Doug Everingham about Australia and the world. So let me start with the Whitlam Connection. The Whitlam Institute within Western Sydney was tasked by Gough himself to, and I quote, help the great and continuing work of building a more equal, open, tolerant and independent Australia. The Institute is deeply committed to Australia's engagement with the world, and I know some of you joined us at the end of 2019 for the Whitlam oration delivered by High Commissioner for Human Rights, Dr. Michelle Bachelet, where in her oration she explored Australia's historic role in the establishment of the UN, Gough Whitlam and other Australians' leadership on international engagement and international human rights law over the decades, as well as the range of human rights challenges that Australia faces today and why it needs to stay engaged internationally. You are probably aware that Gough Whitlam himself was greatly influenced by his father, Fred Whitlam, who represented Australia at the United Nations to develop the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Fred Whitlam participated in the many conferences that helped fashion the post-war global legal environment, particularly in the field of human rights. And he became a fervent internationalist, and Gough embraced the same principle. Gough's commitment to global cooperation contrasted markedly in the late 1960s with the rather isolationist attitudes of Australia to which the nation had reverted in the post-war decades. But when he took office in 1972, Gough was determined to have Australia take its place in the world. being open to both opportunities, but also to Australia's responsibilities. As the Honourable Michael Kirby noted in his excellent Melbourne Law Journal article called Whitlam as Internationalist, during the Whitlam government, over 133 international treaties were entered into force in Australia. Whitlam said in 1975 about his government's ratification of international law, "We've done a great deal more, I believe, than all previous governments. We have communicated to the world our commitment to the international legal system and our eagerness to contribute to cooperative endeavours. And Australia has come to be regarded as an independent voice." This commitment to international cooperation and international law, I believe, changed Australia forever and changed it for the better. Doug Everingham, of course, served as Minister for Health in the Whitlam government from 1972 to 1975. He also represented the Labor Party in the House of Reps from 1967 to 1975 and from 1977 to 1984. He is remembered around the country, of course, for his pivotal role in the formation of the Whitlam government's Medicare program, which was Medibank back then. But I don't need to tell any of you that. So what I hope to share with you today was something of Doug and Goff's ongoing relationship after 1975, which I have had the privilege of learning about through the Whitlam Prime Ministerial Collection, of which the Whitlam Institute is custodian. But by the way, all of these archival materials are available to anyone through the online archive as well. So thanks to our wonderful archivist, I've been able to explore a file of correspondence between the two great men from the 1980s onwards. And I have handpicked a couple of items for this oration. The first one taught me something about the Honourable Doug Everingham that I never knew. Perhaps you do. He was trustee of the Spelling Action Society, which was a society determined to simplify the English language. Now let me see if I can share my screen so that I can share it with you. So I found this letterhead on the back side of a piece of correspondence between Doug and Goff. And this commitment to simplified English on Doug's part was reflected throughout their mutual correspondence. They both wrote to each other as, so Goff wrote to Doug as Doug D-U-G, and Doug wrote to Goff as Goff G-O-F. I just thought that was fantastic. So something else that I learned about a bit more about actually was Doug's commitment to Australian democracy, obviously, and how it might be improved. So he was at one point in around 1999, I think, particularly enamoured of the Swiss system of democracy. And he wrote correspondence to Goff advocating that Australia should change its system in favour of the Swiss model, basically less levels of government in particular. And so I found this letter sharing Goff's own views back to Doug, but I thought you might appreciate it because of the humour that's demonstrated in the relationship between the two of them, as much as because of the content of their discussion. So let me get that one up now. The letter is to Doug from Goff, dated 31st of May 1999, and it reads, "Dear Doug, if Australians are to secure your Swiss-style presidium from the Weekend Australian, you must persuade a member of the National Parliament to introduce a constitution alteration bill for it." And this is the funny part. "A male member, not a Freudian slip, would have to do it since women would remember that Switzerland was the last European state to approve female suffrage." Then he says, "The Swiss did nothing to stop World War II. They made amends by fostering MRA and the financing of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent. At least the latter does more than any or all of the other relief organisations. Warmest regards, Goff, spelt G-O-F, to Doug, spelt D-O-G, D-U-G rather." There are many more items I found in that file that I would have loved to share with you, including a piece of correspondence about an RSL joke that some of you may know more about than I do. I was a little bit mystified, but it sounded very humorous. as well as a cable from Gough at UNESCO Paris that he sent to Doug in Queensland, which was also very humorous. But in the interest of time, and given the subject of this oration, I thought it best just to share one last archival piece with you, and here's hoping I get it right. It's from 1984, and it was a proposal that Doug had made for what he described as a code of conduct for countries and world citizens. It's dated 10th of September 1984. It's called a Code of Conduct for Countries and World Citizens. And it says, we, the people of the world, resolved that the human race and its hopes, ideals and values should continue without the use of violence and destruction as a means of settling our disputes, hereby call upon our leaders, teachers and communicators to stress our common heritage in nature, knowledge, culture and compassion above the quest for belongings or for power over others. And it goes on, but I just couldn't stop thinking when I was looking at the UN Common Agenda that great ideas never age, and Doug's commitment to our own society and democracy, as well as his commitment to a just and democratic global order, are as relevant today as they were in 1984, if not even more so, given the crises that the world is facing at the moment. So, on to those crises. Peace, dignity and equality on a healthy planet. This is the way the UN Secretary General has described the UN Common Agenda, our common agenda. And I thought it was really important that we have some analysis of what that common agenda is if we, as supporters of the UN, are going to encourage our governments to get involved with that common agenda. So I'm not sure how much you might have touched on this morning, but it was on the 10th of September, over a month ago now, that the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, presented his report to the General Assembly in New York, outlining his plan for our common agenda. You may recall that this report was requested by member states on the 75th anniversary of the UN last year. Now, in Australia, perhaps because of our focus on COVID, borders, the economy, even in fact what position Australia will take to COP26, the 26th UN Climate Change Conference, we have heard almost nothing about our common agenda since it was launched. I have searched Australian media, the DFAT webpage, and even the webpage of the Australian Permanent Mission to New York. Not a single trace. So please let me know if you have had more success than I have. I'm struggling to find any discussion about this in Australian society yet. And yet the resonance of what the Secretary General had to say should be clear, relevant, and incredibly pertinent to a country like ours that has over the last 2 years faced drought, devastating bushfires, and now over 18 months of pandemic crisis. As the SG said when he launched the report in September, and I quote, COVID-19 is a wake-up call, and we are oversleeping. The pandemic has demonstrated our collective failure to come together and make joint decisions for the common good, even in the face of an immediate, life-threatening global emergency. Shame on us all, I would say. The SG went on to describe the litany of ways in which global cooperation is broken and how our collective efforts now appear to be too little and too late. Not putting too fine a point on it, the Secretary General said we're at a fork in the road where we can either break down or break through. The future of the planet and humankind is at stake, nothing less. I don't know about you, but in my lifetime, I don't think I've ever felt a more urgent call to action. And the Secretary General's report is a call to action for member states, for civil society, for regional organisations, and for us as individuals. The call to action is built around 4 aims. Firstly, strengthening global governance, not a new one. Secondly, focusing on the future, also not a new one. Thirdly, renewing the social contract. And fourthly, ensuring a United Nations fit for a new era. So here is just some of what the UN is proposing. Let me share with you now from my reading of our common agenda. So firstly, for 2023, the SG is proposing a higher level summit of the future. This Summit of the Future will aim to forge a new global consensus on what our future should look like and how we can secure it. The summit will include a new agenda for peace that takes a more comprehensive and holistic view of global security. It would also include tracks on sustainable development and climate action beyond 2030, a global digital compact to guarantee that new technologies are a force for good and protect human rights, the peaceful and sustainable use of outer space, as well as a stream to develop plans for the management of future shocks and crises. The SG's report is proposing biennial summits at a really high level, so the level of heads of state and government between the G20, ECOSOC, and the heads of international financial institutions. The overriding aim of these summits would be to create a more sustainable, inclusive, and resilient global economy, including fairer multilateral systems to manage global trade and technological development. In addition to this, the Secretary-General is planning to convene all stakeholders ahead of the first global stocktake of the Paris Agreement in 2023 to consider further urgent steps that need to be taken now. Member states are already preparing a strong post-2020 biodiversity framework, as well as for the 2021 Food System Summit and the Stockholm Plus 50 Summit on the environment for next year as well. Really interestingly for me, I think, the Secretary-General is proposing a declaration on future generations to provide a new focus on the world's young people and future generations who will inherit the consequences of our decisions, but who are barely represented at the global table at all. The Secretary-General will appoint a special envoy for future generations to give weight to the interests of those who will be born over the coming century. A new United Nations Youth Office will upgrade engagement with young people across all the UN's work so that today's young women and men can be designers of their own future. I think that would be a very positive thing. To start, there will be measures on education, skills training, and lifelong learning, including a Transforming Education Summit in 2023. Another interesting recommendation of the report is that there should be a futures lab that will work with governments, academia, civil society, the private sector, and others, bringing together all our work around forecasting, megatrends, and risks. The Futures Lab will collect and analyse data, but also build on existing mechanisms, such as the annual IMF early warning exercise, to issue regular reports on megatrends and catastrophic risk. Now, to improve preparedness for future shocks, the report recommends an emergency platform that would be triggered automatically in large-scale crises, like the pandemic, bringing together leaders from member states, the UN system, key country groupings, the IFIs, regional groups, civil society, the private sector, and research bodies. A series of measures is planned to renew the social contract between governments and people, and between people, to provide universal health coverage, education, housing, decent work, and income protection for everyone, everywhere. The Secretary-General is proposing a World Social Summit in 2025 around this new social contract, in particular to give a strong push in the final years to the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, there's a lot more in there, but in terms of sharing with you a summary of what I thought was really interesting about the Common Agenda, the report makes the case that the UN itself must adapt to support the vision contained in our Common Agenda. The UN is the only institution that exists with universal convening power, and our Common Agenda must therefore include upgrading the UN to be fit for purpose. So the Secretary-General is advocating for a UN 2.0 that can offer more relevant, system-wide, multilateral and multi-stakeholder solutions to the challenges of the 21st century. To share just one example of how he intends to strengthen the UN, the Secretary-General is planning to re-establish his Scientific Advisory Board in order to strengthen the role of the UN as a source of reliable data and evidence in the face of so much fake news. Now, look, I know that especially listening to this rather than looking at it on a page, all this sounds really daunting and overwhelming. But let's remember that the UN has been consulting member states, civil society, regional organisations and academics about this Common Agenda over the last 12 months since the announcement on the 75th anniversary. So these plans don't come out of thin air, and they build on a lot of, as you would know, really good existing work. I myself know people who've been working at the coalface of this report and who really genuinely believe it's not only essential and the only way out, but also viable if we commit to it. So as the Secretary-General said, and I quote, "Global governance may sound lofty or abstract. It is not. These decisions have life or death consequences for you and your citizens, from the quality of the air we breathe to the chance to earn a living wage and the risk of catching a deadly disease. Multilateral action led by the UN has achieved an enormous amount over the past 76 years, from preventing a third world war to eradicating smallpox and mending the hole in the ozone layer." He goes on to say, "My report must be a starting point for ideas and initiatives that build on these achievements and take them further. I urge you all to act on your joint responsibility to ensure we achieve the breakthrough we need." So, despite the fact that we've barely heard about our common agenda here in Australia yet, in some good news, on Tuesday of this week just gone, Australia spoke at the General Assembly in support of the resolution on our common agenda. So what that resolution does is welcomes the Secretary-General's report, requests the Secretary-General on behalf of the member states of the General Assembly to implement those elements of the report that are under his authority. And thirdly, it commits the member states and the General Assembly to act on those elements within the General Assembly's remit. Now, of course, supporting the resolution in the General Assembly does not prejudice any future decisions, and nor does it commit any member state to action. So now it really is up to us, up to those who care about Australia's future and the future of the planet, to raise awareness of this new call to action that's contained in this agenda. We need to ensure our governments at all levels know that Australians care about our common future and support the UN Secretary-General's plans for breakthrough as opposed to breakdown, which is the only other option. So, aside from supporting a resolution in the General Assembly, what else can Australia be doing now? You all know we're on the verge of COP26, and you will have observed developments in Australia's stance in recent weeks. I neither have the time today nor the expertise to take a deep dive into the issues arising out of COP26, but a very close friend of mine at UNDP has recently been involved with producing a video called "Don't Choose Extinction." I don't know if it's come up this morning at all, or if any of you have seen this video yet. It features the voice of Jack Black as Frankie the dinosaur. And so with your indulgence, I'm going to try and share it. It's only 2 minutes, and I hope you'll enjoy it and share it on. Let me see if I can manage this now.
You okay? You need a minute? Cool. Okay. Listen up, people. I know a thing or two about extinction. And let me tell you, and you'd kind of think this would be obvious, going extinct is a bad thing. And driving yourselves extinct in 70 million years, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. At least we had an asteroid. What's your excuse? You're headed for a climate disaster, and yet every year governments spend hundreds of billions of public funds on fossil fuel subsidies. Imagine if we had spent hundreds of billions per year subsidizing giant meteors. That's what you're doing right now. Think of all the other things you could do with that money. Around the world, people are living in poverty. Don't you think helping them would make more sense than, I don't know, Paying for the demise of your entire species? Let me be real for a second. You got a huge opportunity right now. As you rebuild your economies and bounce back from this pandemic, this is humanity's big chance. So here's my wild idea. Don't choose extinction. Save your species before it's too late. It's time for you humans to stop making excuses and start making changes. Thank you.
I wanted to share that with you because I think this is a real opportunity for us to use these fantastic tools that the UN is producing to raise awareness with new audiences about why COP26, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the new Common Agenda is so important and why Australia should be involved. So on a final note, I just wanted to talk briefly in terms of what else Australia can be doing to support international collaboration for our shared future by touching on the SDGs, which have featured so pointedly in your celebrations today. I'm not telling you anything new when I say that Australia was one of 193 countries that came together at the high-level UN Sustainable Development Summit in New York in September 2015 to commit to achieve the 23 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its 17 Sustainable Development Goals. As you all know, the SDGs are a universal agenda, and so their implementation is the shared responsibility of all countries at all stages of development, including OECD nations like Australia. And yet, despite a 2018 parliamentary inquiry into Australia's SDG implementation, which issued 18 recommendations on how Australia could do better at implementing its SDG obligations, none have yet been taken up by the Commonwealth Government. In fact, it issued a dissenting report. So while we know that there is much SDG relevant activity and knowledge within the Australian business community, the civil society sector, and some state and territory governments, as well as local governments, the Australian government needs to stop treating the SDGs like a foreign policy commitment and recognise that they're different to the Millennium Development Goals and set up a national structure for the full implementation of SDGs in Australia's domestic policy, all the areas of Australia's domestic policy, linking those areas to the SDGs so that no Australian is left behind. And so Australia can report on the very good work that's already going on to move Australia closer to that 2030 agenda. The Whitlam Institute's 2020 research on the SDGs, called No One Left Behind, Implementing the SDGs in Australia, was led by the wonderful Dr. Claire Brolin from the University of Queensland. And it makes a series of recommendations that are based on an analysis of international best practice about how Australia can do better. They're very practical tools and suggestions for how any government in the world, in fact, could pick up this best practice document and find a better way to implement the SDGs. So I'd really encourage you to read the research if you're interested at whitlam.org to find out how you also can advocate to our government and governments about Australia's governmental responsibilities under the SDGs. So let me finish off now. I just wanted to say, something personally. If you are a parent too, like me, or a grandparent, or indeed anyone who cares about the future of humanity and the planet, you must be feeling, as I do, that the future that I have been part of serving up to my 7-year-old son is a terrifying one. Historians will say that there is nothing new, that there have been other times in history where the world has faced crises like these. Well, not in my lifetime, and I'm not sure how far back you have to go to witness the same perfect storm of climate threat, geopolitical instability, security challenges, loss of trust in democracy and government, lack of faith in multilateral cooperation, and massive inequality within and between nations. The Secretary-General is right. We are out of time. We must take up our common agenda. because the alternative is unbearable. So in solidarity with all of you, thanks a lot for listening, and I wish you all the very best for the rest of the day. Take care.